Hey everybody, I wanted to comment briefly on a really interesting tidbit regarding the triumphal entry, and particularly Matthew's presentation of the triumphal entry. He notoriously describes Jesus riding into Jerusalem on two animals at the same time, and this is represented awkwardly in some medieval paintings of the triumphal entry. Now Luke and Mark, their accounts have him coming in on just a single colt, but Matthew tells the story quite differently, and there's a perfectly good reason for this. Matthew is famous for depicting Jesus as fulfilling a number of Hebrew Bible prophecies. That's one of his main rhetorical goals. And he was fastidious about ensuring that Jesus fulfilled these prophecies exactly. Now, in the Hebrew, there's some parallelism going on. It describes king riding upon a donkey and a colt, the foal or the offspring of a donkey. That's appositional, it's poetic, it's saying a donkey, that is to say, or yea, even a colt, the foal of a donkey. But when that gets translated into Greek, the conjunction that comes through, the K or Chi, according to the Erasmian pronunciation, in Greek, that apposition, that parallelism does not come through as clearly. Now, Matthew is consulting his Hebrew Bible in Greek. Whether that's because he doesn't read the Hebrew or because he just wants a translation that already exists for convenience sake, I don't know. But he probably went to that text and read this, understood it to mean he was riding two animals at the same time, and was like, okay, and inserted that into his story. And so we have this awkward story of Jesus riding upon two animals at the same time. Now, this is weird, but I think this illustrates something important about the way we approach the Bible. We have a number of places where two or more different texts are describing the same event or the same story, and they tell the story in different ways. Now, what a lot of people try to do is harmonize them and try to make them both fit. And that presumes that these are both accurate historical kind of verbatim accounts. And that presupposition, I think, is dangerous. What we can do with the knowledge of what's going on in Matthew is recognize that each author is writing for different reasons, with different rhetorical goals, and using different sources and resources and conventions to get there. And if we can learn to better parse apart why the different authors are approaching these texts in the different ways, what they're trying to accomplish with their own particular approach to specific events or stories, I think we can get much closer to what they wanted us to do with the text. It's not so much about what the text means as it is about what the author wanted the text to do, how they wanted it to function. If we know that, we can better read the Bible. Hey everybody, I thought I'd comment on this video that just came across my page from Mom Millennial. She says, let's irritate entrenched thought. Now, that is always a wonderful idea. All thought needs to be repeatedly interrogated, and particularly entrenched thought. But I would argue that it needs to be done from an informed position, which is not what she's doing in this video. She is going to argue that the pharaoh Khufu, who's responsible for one of the great pyramids at Giza, was actually a black woman, but that has been scrubbed from the material remains by the Nazis who discovered it and by the entrenched racism and sexism within archaeology today. Now, there's absolutely racism and sexism entrenched within the foundations of archaeology, Egyptology, classics, biblical studies, all these places, and people are hard at work trying to root it out. But does her argument here hold water? Let's take a look at it. She builds this argument off one piece of statuary. Well, first off of the fact that we don't have a lot to go on regarding who Khufu was. But the main argument comes from this piece of statuary that depicts a man named Seneb, who was a high-ranking Egyptian official who was also a little person. And the only statuary that survives in full that depicts him from his burial is a limestone statue that depicts him seated next to his wife. Now, rather than depict his legs not reaching the floor next to his wife, they have Seneb folding his legs underneath him, and where his legs would be, they have depicted two of his three oldest children. Now, right off the bat, Mom Millennial says that's messed up, that only two of the three children are depicted. She doesn't seem to know that they're there for a reason, to fill out the artistic convention to show where his legs would be. She's also going to argue that the wife and the oldest daughter are depicted as light-skinned because the darker skin paint has been scrubbed off of them. The problem is they are depicted as light skinned because they've been painted white. In antiquity, they were painted white because, again, this is part of the artistic convention. High-ranking women were depicted as lighter skinned because they were inside all day, whereas high-ranking men were outside in the sun and are depicted as darker skinned. So we have yet to deviate from the standard artistic norms and mores of the time. So nothing unusual about any of this. Finally, she's going to argue that the two cartouches that identify the children identify them as the two pharaohs whose mortuary cult Seneb served, Rajdef and Khufu. However, what she doesn't know is that the children's names are actually longer than what's in the cartouche. They are compound names. The oldest son is Rajdef Ankh, and the oldest daughter is Awib Khufu, which is Khufu is happy versus may Rajdef live. So, yes, only pharaohs were depicted in cartouches, but the names can be longer than that. So, bad argument.
Before you come to my page and drop a comment like that, you might want to educate yourself.
So you got to do better than this, dude. The Constitution was not ratified in 1791. It was ratified in 1788. The Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791, not 1793. The puckle gun was invented in Great Britain, and only about 2 were ever made, and it was never used in any war. So Madison clearly did not have that in mind with the Second Amendment, which was indisputably about the states' rights to arm militias because they didn't trust standing armies. Now, the Massachusetts Compromise did not guarantee a Bill of Rights. It was actually about strong encouragement to amend the Constitution, and the colonies sent in lists of recommendations for amendment. And when Madison came back with his 12 amendments that became 10 that were stuck at the end, they said, this isn't what we wanted. We wanted to fundamentally alter things, not just add these 10 amendments to the end. So get educated yourself.
The framers at their core were elitists. They gave around 1/6 of the population the right to vote. They designed a republic of elites for elites. What do you think they meant when they referred to state representation? States are not corporeal entities. They don't have interests. They're legal entities, jurisdictions. They were talking about the representation of elites within that state. The Senate was created because allocating too much power by population would make the elites in small states have weaker ability to pursue their interests in the federal government compared to elites in large states. So they put the most significant legislative functions, consent to pass laws, staffing the executive, seating federal judges, in one chamber, and they let state governments, which were made of elites in that state, select other elites to go fill it. And ever since, normal people have been trying to claw back that power. The Senate doesn't protect states from other states. It ensures that the interests of elites dominate the interests of the electorate. When you make this argument, you're carrying their water, you're protecting their interests, and you get nothing for it.
Hey everybody, wanted to talk for a couple minutes on prophecy of the Hebrew Bible and how it differs from the prophecy of the broader ancient Near East. Now, all prophecy builds on the perception that deities have full access to strategic information, and that is any information that might be able to help us in decision making. So leaders of communities, of tribes, of nations, this is very important to them as they're trying to decide where to travel to, where to plant, when to plant, who to attack, whether to attack, those kinds of things. So how do we get access to this information? Well, there are a bunch of ways. In the broader ancient Near East, these were divided into kind of different guilds that practiced these things. You had the ecstatic prophets, and that was something where they went into a trance in a specific time and place in order to receive some kind of information and pass it along right away. More closely related to what the kings were looking out for were the diviners, the people who were trained using manuals, and we have some of these manuals, to interpret systematically omens that were given just in the natural world. So there are a variety of different ways to do this. You look through a manual and it would say, if this and then this and then this happens, that's unfavorable. But if this and this and this happens, that's favorable. And they could also look into the natural world. The flight path of birds could be a way to divine things. You cut the liver out of a sheep and you look at its shape and you look at its coloration, things like that. That's called extispicy. That's another way to divine, get access to that information. So the biblical prophets, they begin to innovate on these genres. They have the ecstatic prophecy. They have the divination. The Urim and Tumim are tools of divination. So is the ephod. They begin to put them together, and they also begin to write everything down and send it out. So they become kind of messenger prophets. And a big part of this writing down was to try to establish the authority of the prophet. And their their ability to declare these things. And one of the reasons is that they are not usually in the employ of the king. In fact, frequently they are antagonistic toward the king. So they need to establish their authority. And one of the ways that they do that is through the divine council. In the broader ancient Near East, prophets kind of spied on the divine council, overheard it so that they knew what the gods were doing. There's a good book by a guy named Alan Lindsay called Secrecy in the Gods that talks in great detail about this. The biblical prophets kind of elevate the role of the prophet. Jeremiah asks rhetorically, who has stood in the council of Yahweh? So suggesting, I have stood in the council. Isaiah goes one step further. He actually says his lips have been purified so that he can participate in the council and he can volunteer when God calls for a volunteer. And it gets to the point where they're even invoking and calling the council into session. And this is all done for purposes of establishing authority and saying, I'm better than them.
Has been translated a bunch of times in many different ways, and this is part of why it's an unreliable.
So I think what you two mean to say is that the manuscripts of the Bible have been copied numerous times over, some manuscripts more so than others, and also edited and redacted, because the number of times the text has been translated is absolutely immaterial if you have the source text, because you can always just go back to the source text. And we have the source text for the vast, vast majority of translations that have ever been executed. The only one I can think of off the top of my head that complicates this is the Septuagint, because we have some of the source text, we can reconstruct some of the source text, and some of the sources we just don't know. But the number of times the text is translated has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on how well we can understand the source text if we have access to them. Hey everybody, wanted to share a thought on scholarly perspectives on the character of Judas. Now, we have to go back to the first gospel written, Mark. In this gospel, Judas is never portrayed as being possessed by Satan, as being a thief, or as being directly condemned by name by Jesus. In that gospel, he is portrayed as a faithful follower who merely arranges for Jesus' confrontation with the authorities in the hopes likely that this would catalyze a grand battle that Jesus would win. That's not what happens. But this doesn't come through clearly in English translation because the verb for hand over or deliver, paradidomi, is frequently translated as betrayed, but in reality it's just a generic reference to handing Jesus over. It is not until later Gospels that all these other things are added to it. But this is why it's important to read text on their own terms rather than in the light of other texts, because frequently they say something different. Hey everybody, have you ever had a member of a religious group say, this is why we perform this ritual? That happens a lot, but a lot of people don't really understand what's going on with rituals, and a lot of those explanations are pretty arbitrary. I want to share some thoughts on the cognitive science of religion and how it understands the function of ritual, both on an individual level as well as on a social level, and I'm going to start with the latter. Within a social group, and this can be as small as a congregation or as large as a nation, rituals function to do two things. They function as costly signaling and as credibility enhancing displays. So costly signaling means it signals to the other members of the group that an individual is dedicated to the group's survival and to its mores and values. The higher the cost of the ritual, so the time committed, perhaps money, perhaps pain, perhaps effort, the higher that cost, the more reliably it is perceived by other members of the society as signaling that commitment. And we can trust people who are willing to go through that. That's what intuitively we think. Now we have three different levels of engagement in those costly signalings. Some people are sincerely committed to the group and to its values. Some people are not so committed, but they perceive that there's some benefit in membership and they recognize this is just something you have to do. Other people are more cynical and recognize this is just the way to exploit membership in the group and increase one's standing. And that brings up the credibility enhancing displays. That's a way to increase your standing in the group and show, hey, I'm really committed. And this is how rituals build on themselves, by people saying, no, I'm going to go one more step to show you I'm even more committed. So now on an individual level, There are lots of explanations for rituals. Very, very few of them have anything whatsoever to do with the actual reasons for the origin of the ritual. What they do is make them meaningful to an individual in a given cognitive ecology, so time, place, intellectual context. Because on a social level, rituals help a society to survive, but individuals rarely understand it on that level. They want the rituals to mean something to them, and so they want to understand what's going on. However, because everybody's different, places, times, contexts, historical circumstances are all different, the explanations that are going to bring meaning to people can differ as well. So every explanation is really a rationalization that helps individuals feel like this ritual is meaningful. So next time somebody says, this is why we do this ritual, try to understand a little better what's going on. Hey everybody, I want to take 3 minutes to try to share some thoughts on the concept of cults. I've been seeing this term thrown around a lot lately. When it's used pejoratively, it's pretty much always used to mean a religious group I don't like. It's very difficult to gin up any more analytical legitimacy than that, because any attempts to delineate it invariably rope in groups that are not intended, and it's also always used pejoratively in reference to broader social values which change, and so the definitions would always change. But people say, well, I need something to refer to dangerous groups. Yeah, all religious groups can be dangerous. All social groups can be dangerous once the interests of the group take priority over broader social values. And that also includes the counter and anti-cult movements. And that's another thing that a lot of people don't understand when they use the term cult, the history of those movements. Now, the counter-cult is usually used to refer to Christian opposition to cults, and this has a long history that goes way back, but really began to escalate in the 60s when parents began to get very concerned about their teenage and adult children running off to the woods with hippies to learn how to transcend this world. Non-religious parents also started to get concerned, and that gave rise to the anti-cult movement. These two movements really got up and running in the 70s and 80s. They started to gain legitimacy in the scholarly and medical community. They pathologized membership in new religious movements. That means they turned it into a mental health issue, which legitimized their frameworks of brainwashing and deprogramming, and also legitimized their work in those fields. Unfortunately, they took it way too far. They started kidnapping people. They started abusing people. Deprogramming took on a lot of nasty aspects. And in the late 80s and early 90s, they lost a lot of the support of the scientific community. Psychologists started saying, we're not doing this anymore. There's no legitimacy to this. And as a result, they lost some big court cases, and then they lost the money. And this is why you won't really find much peer-reviewed scholarship at all that focuses on cults after the mid-90s. You still have scattered scholars who do it, but they're pretty much on their own because the scholarly community moved past it and abandoned these frameworks. However, they still survive in a lot of ways. Concepts of brainwashing are still around, deprogramming, and also the pathologizing of religious membership. This has actually been taken over in the new atheist movement by some folks who like to treat membership in religion as delusion, as a mental health problem. This is just rhetoric that was adopted from the anti-encounter cult movements. So I don't like the word cult because it has no analytical value. It just means a religious group I don't like. And keep that in mind when you hear it. Hey everybody, wanted to do a video with a little more detail on the Hebrew word Elohim for you. Now, as I mentioned before, Elohim is a plural form of the more basic Hebrew term El, which is very closely related to the broader Northwest Semitic term that just means deity or can be used adjectively to mean divine. Now, in Hebrew, we have two plural forms, Elim and Elohim. Elim is more closely related to the plural from the cognate languages. It's pretty rare in the Hebrew Bible, though. Elohim is by far more common. But there's no difference in meaning. They mean the exact same thing, and they are used interchangeably in the text. They can be anyway. Now, Elohim is a plural, but it is grammatically plural, but it has been used, or it's most commonly used in reference to singular entities. Now, for a long time, a lot of people they called this the plural of majesty. The idea being this entity exemplifies the qualities of the noun deity, and so They call it a plural of majesty. That framework doesn't really work, however, because the exact same phenomenon occurs in all the cognate languages where this is supposed to happen with words like slave. And so they made up this concept of the plural of humility, which is silly. Is the exact same phenomenon. So that framework doesn't work. We have to find something that fits better. And I'm going to suggest the best argument is that proposed by Joel Burnett in his book from almost 2 decades ago called A Reassessment of Biblical Elohim. And what he argues is that Elohim is different from Elohim because it was intended to be marked as an abstract plural. So you have El meaning deity, Elohim would mean divinity. So the abstract notion of deity, but it would have been used so frequently with reference to particular instantiations of deity, particular deities, that it would then come back around and be concretized all over again. So he calls it a concretized abstract plural, and this makes a lot better sense of the word, including how the masculine plural Elohim can be used in reference to singular feminine deities like Asherah. Is referred to as an Elohim, and that's because the concretized abstract plural is not gendered. Elim, and if we had a feminine form in the Hebrew Bible, Elat or Elat, those would be gender. That would be God and goddess. But Elohim just means deity. It's not gendered. So how can we tell if it's singular or plural? The clearest way is to look at the verbs and the pronouns. Are they plural or are they singular? Now, this doesn't work every single time because sometimes in poetry, the value of the meter and the rhyme can compel authors to use the plural when they're really talking about the singular. But that's really fuzzy and hard to distinguish. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you've got any questions in the comments.